Las Vegas.
It's more than just a city.
It's a feeling.
It's that feeling of excitement when you spot the lights of the strip out the airplane window.
It's that feeling of awe as you stroll down the boulevard, taking in the sights and sounds.
And it's that feeling of satisfaction, knowing that you're in the greatest city in the world.
Over 42 million people from around the world share that feeling every year.
And I'm one of them.
Taking you to the world-famous Vegas Strip and beyond, my name is Jeff, and this is Jeff Does Vegas. Hey there, and welcome to episode number 107 of Jeff Does Vegas. Before we get into this episode of the podcast, I want to take the time to thank my guests from the last episode, Jason and Paula Williams, hosts of the Vegas Fever podcast. Jason and Paula came on the show to talk about the future of pro sports in Las Vegas. We discussed the impact the Vegas Golden Knights have had, potential homes for NBA and MLB teams, and whether or not Vegas can continue to support all the pro and minor league franchises that keep popping up in the city. If you haven't checked it out yet, jump into the archives at jeffdoesvegas.com or search out episode number 106, The Big League, on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Okay, here we go. On to the show. At last count, there were roughly 4.4 million podcasts available, with just over 1 million of them considered active, in that they've released a new episode within the last 90 days. And including the one you're currently listening to, there are hundreds of Las Vegas-related podcasts covering all sorts of topics, from broad general Las Vegas information to hyper-focused niches like history and sports betting. Over the last while, I've been asked on a few occasions for my recommendations for Las Vegas podcasts that aren't my podcast. So I thought it was time to buckle down, make a list, and put together some thoughts on my favorite Vegas podcasts. There's a ton of great content out there and some absolutely amazing creators. Choosing just a few shows wasn't easy, but I hope you enjoy as I share the love for these fellow Vegas podcasts. Las Vegas history is a topic that I absolutely love exploring. And based on the reaction that I get from you guys every time I release a Vegas history episode, I can tell that you guys love it too. As luck would have it, there are several Vegas history podcasts floating around out there, and I wanted to take a moment to share a few of my favorites. Let's start off with Mobbed Up, The Fight for Las Vegas. This is one of my all-time favorite Vegas history podcasts. It's a production of the Las Vegas Review-Journal teaming up with the Mob Museum, so you know that the information in this series is going to be factually accurate and very in-depth. Mobbed Up takes a deep dive into the history of organized crime in Las Vegas. There are currently 2 seasons available. Season 1 features 11 episodes and some bonus material. It's hosted by Reed Redmond, who is actually a guest on this podcast all the way back on episode number 22. This season focuses on the stories of Frank Rosenthal, Tony Spilatro, the Hole in the Wall Gang, the Argent Corporation, and the Stardust. It's one of the more well-known mob stories in Las Vegas. If you're familiar with the movie Casino at all, the classic starring Robert De Niro, Joe Pesci, Sharon Stone, directed by Marty Scorsese, you are going to be very familiar with this particular story. There is a ton of amazing material in this season, but there's no doubt that the highlight is the late Frank Cullotta, who was a legit mobster and gangster and member of the Hole in the Wall gang. Reed Redmond had the opportunity to drive around Las Vegas with Frank Cullotta as his personal tour guide, sharing incredible insight into the Vegas mob scene. Season 2 of Mobbed Up consists of 8 episodes and a couple of bonus episodes. It's hosted by longtime Las Vegas Review-Journal reporter Jeff German. Focuses on a lesser-known Vegas mob story, and that is the battle between Wayne Newton and Johnny Carson to buy the Aladdin after the state of Nevada banned the property's owners over their alleged mob ties. Now, this season also takes a little bit of a sidetrack into the disappearance of Teamsters boss Jimmy Hoffa and the connection to Las Vegas. Would seem that the Teamsters used their pension fund to loan a lot of money to Las Vegas developers to build various casinos. This season includes some incredible interviews with the likes of former lawyers, judges, state officials, and even Las Vegas icon Wayne Newton, who makes an appearance to share his side of the story surrounding the purchase of the Aladdin and his alleged mob ties. Now, personally, I preferred season 1 more than season 2, and I think that just simply had to do with my familiarity with that story versus the story of the Aladdin, and I think that'll likely be much the same for you. As interesting as the story about the Aladdin was, people are much more familiar with that story about the Stardust and Frank Rosenthal and Tony Spilotro, thanks to the movie Casino. If you're a real Vegas history nerd, you're going to love season number 2. But if you just have casual interest in Vegas history and mob history, you're probably going to like season 1 better. A relatively new entry into the Vegas history category is a podcast called Wild Things, Siegfried and Roy. This is a new podcast from Stephen Leckert, who's a journalist and filmmaker. You might not be familiar with his name, but chances are you've seen his work. He recently released a documentary series called Challenger, The Final Flight, that ran on Netflix, and an HBO documentary called What's My Name, Muhammad Ali. This podcast goes deep into the history of one of Vegas's most famous acts of all time, Siegfried and Roy. It's a deep dive into the investigation that followed the infamous Tiger attack that put an end to the duo's long-running Vegas show. Now, there are lots of different theories on what caused the attack. Was it provoked by animal rights groups or anti-LGBTQ plus groups? Was the Tiger trying to save Roy's life from a stroke, as the pair would later claim in interviews after the incident? Or was it just a case of a wild animal being a wild animal? This podcast looks into all of those theories and many, many more. Something else that the podcast takes a deep dive into is the relationship between Siegfried and Roy. It was always suspected that the pair were a couple, but it was never really confirmed. And a lot of that was likely just due to the era in which the pair hit it big. There's some amazing interviews in this podcast, including Annette Tappert, who's the author of the Siegfried and Roy autobiography, David Neal, who was a USDA investigator who looked into the attack, Michael Game, who was a Las Vegas Metro Police Department officer who worked a counterterrorism angle on the attack, and dancers and cast members who were present at the Mirage the night of the attack. The story also covers Roy's recovery and the pair's return to the stage in 2009 for an ABC TV special. Honestly, this is one of the best produced podcasts I've ever listened to. Not just Vegas related, but best ever. Every episode is a cliffhanger and leaves you wanting to hear more. 8 episodes for this series really doesn't seem like enough, and I would love to see some bonus episodes. Now, before we move on to the next podcast, I did want to share a few Siegfried and Roy fun facts with you. The Siegfried and Roy theme song, Mind is the Magic, was written and performed by Michael Jackson. The tiger that attacked Roy was named Manticore, which translates from Middle Persian to man-eater, and Siegfried and Roy performed 6 nights a week, 44 weeks a year at the Mirage. They attracted about 400,000 people per year and sold approximately $44 million worth of tickets every year. And finally, from the Vegas history category, I wanted to share this podcast, Spectacle Las Vegas. This is actually season 2 of the series Spectacle. Season 1 focused on the world of reality TV. Season 2 focusing on the history of Las Vegas. Hosted by Brent Holmes, who is a Vegas-based journalist, artist, and cultural critic. He also happens to be the son of longtime Vegas headliner and legend Clint Holmes. Now, this is a podcast not so much for the Vegas nerds, but more so for the casual Las Vegas fan. Doesn't really go in depth on any one subject. The podcast broadly covers a bunch of different topics, including the rise of Las Vegas as an entertainment city, weddings in Las Vegas, the mob in Las Vegas, and the story of Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas from Hunter S. Thompson. The hardcore Vegas fan is probably already going to know a lot of what's being covered in this series. However, one standout episode for me was episode 4, Moulin Rouge and the Segregation of Las Vegas and the Integration of Las Vegas and Black Performers. This is a topic that really isn't covered in a lot of different places, and I found the whole story fascinating and disturbing at the same time. Really made me want to learn a lot more about that particular period in Las Vegas history, and as such, I'm going to look at doing a future episode of my own podcast on this particular topic. Again, overall, Spectacle Las Vegas, a very well put together podcast and perfect for anybody who's looking to learn a lot about the various facets of Vegas's history and its influence on pop culture. With the rise of pro sports in Las Vegas over the last several years has come the rise of pro sports related podcasts in Las Vegas over the last several years. And I wanted to take a couple of moments to share some of my favorites. I want to start off with Sin Bin Vegas. This is the premier Vegas Golden Knights podcast. Hosted by Ken Boehlke and Jason Poitier, they started their podcast well before hockey officially came to Las Vegas. They were at this for several years prior to the announcement of the Vegas Golden Knights coming to town. There are a couple of radio guys and sports fans who are looking to get involved in the hockey scene in Las Vegas. As such, they got in on the ground floor with this podcast, and they now have a very deep relationship with the Vegas Golden Knights organization and their ownership, which is not something that most independent sports podcasts have. Yes, if you have a podcast that's produced by one of the big sports networks, then absolutely, they're going to have that relationship with a pro sports team. These guys are not those guys. Now, to be fair, Sin Bin is more than just a podcast. They run live streams, both pre and post game. They do full Vegas Golden Knights analysis. They do injury reports. They do lineups. They do trades and trade rumors. And then they also run betting odds sponsored by William Hill Race and Sportsbook, which is an official Vegas Golden Knights partner. They're also incredibly involved in the community, and they've hosted various events in Las Vegas, including their annual bin ball tourney that they host at the Space just off the Strip, which usually features players, coaches, and even an opportunity to win some very cool Vegas Golden Knights merchandise. If you want to go deep with the Vegas Golden Knights, Sin Bin is the podcast that you need to check out. I also want to talk about a brand new podcast on the Vegas sports podcast scene, and that is the Vegas Fever podcast. Jason and Paula Williams are the host of this podcast, and they bring a really unique spin to sports podcasts in that they are a husband and wife team. They're former Vegas residents, recently moved out of Las Vegas, and they are rabid Vegas Golden Knights fans. Every episode they release, they go deep, deep, deep into hockey discussions and share their thoughts and opinions on the Vegas Golden Knights. They were lucky enough to recently become affiliates of the Inside the Rink podcast network, which has helped to get them out to a huge audience. In addition to Vegas Golden Knights content, Jason and Paula go deep into UNLV sports, the NCAA, and other Vegas sports. They also cover betting and gambling. And I recently had them on my podcast, episode number 106 to be exact, titled The Big League. We had a conversation about the future of pro sports in Las Vegas. Highly recommend you give that one a listen and go check out their podcast as well. Now, as a Canadian, I am legally obligated to be a hockey fan. As I've joked numerous times, us Canadians, we pretty much come out of the womb wearing skates. As such, I'm not a big NFL fan or a Raiders fan, so I don't listen to any Las Vegas Raiders podcasts, but I know that there are several out there. So I wanted to take a moment to share some in case you happen to be a Raiders fan. Some of the updated and current podcasts include Locked On Raiders, which is updated daily with tons of great Raiders info. Vegas Nation, which is another Las Vegas Review Journal podcast. They update that every few days. And the Silver and Black Pride podcast, which is a production of the SB Nation Las Vegas Raiders online community. They update that podcast every few days during the off season and much more frequently during the NFL season. I wanted to take this opportunity to shine the spotlight on some other Vegas podcast creators, people who are putting out some absolutely incredible material, going deep into the world of Las Vegas and sharing their passion for the city of Las Vegas with their listeners. Starting off with the Vegas Confessions podcast. This is a long-time Vegas podcast. They've been around since late 2017, almost 5 years now. The show's hosted by Julian Romero, aka Jay, and features some incredible interviews with everyone from casino CEOs to restaurant owners to entertainers and other vloggers, bloggers, and podcasters. Jay uses his show to share trip reports, reviews of hotels, restaurants, and attractions, as well as tips and tricks for your Vegas trip. And all of it relates to the Strip, downtown, and the surrounding areas. Now, something cool that Jay is doing, not only is Vegas Confessions a podcast, but they're running a YouTube channel as well with a ton of incredible material on there. Everything from walks up and down the Strip to live interviews to live streams to restaurant walkthroughs, casino walkthroughs, room walkthroughs. Some very, very cool material in there. So I would highly recommend you go and give Jay and Vegas Confessions a follow. Another great podcast that I love listening to is called Talk About Las Vegas with Ira. Ira David Steinberg is the host of this show, and every week, Ira takes the opportunity to talk with entertainers, writers, and personalities who either are currently or have been part of the Vegas landscape. Ira is a longtime broadcaster who's also had PR and marketing gigs within the casino and hotel industry in Vegas. His guests have included authors, comedians, actors, musicians, and many others. Some of my favorite episodes include his interviews with Brian Newman, Shin Lim, Jen Kramer, Lance Burton, Jim Belushi, and the late Louis Anderson. And I have to give some love to fellow Canadians Fred Hazelton and Seb Gagnon, the hosts of the Unofficial Vegas podcast. Fred is a frequent Vegas visitor and a writer for the Unofficial Vegas Guide. Seb is Fred's pal, who's tagged along on a few trips to Las Vegas along with Fred. They launched their podcast back a couple of years ago to answer questions about Las Vegas. They cover a ton of great topics for Vegas visitors, including how to properly research your trip, solo trip advice, how to do Vegas with kids, whether or not to use a travel agent, sports in Vegas, and much more. It's a well-presented, well-researched podcast, a lot of fun to listen to. Highly recommend you go and check it out. And finally, one of my favorites is the On the Corner of Main Street podcast. This show is hosted by Jonathan Jossel, who just happens to be the CEO of the Plaza Hotel and Casino in downtown Las Vegas. This is a very, very cool Vegas podcast. The show features interviews with special guests, including gaming industry members, entertainers, Vegas locals. Some of their past guests have included Nevada Governor Steve Sisolak, Nevada historian Michael Green, Corey Harrison of Pawn Stars, Anthony Curtis, who runs the Vegas Advisor, comedian Doug Stanhope, rapper Flavor Flav, and one of the more frequent guests who makes appearances on the podcast is former mayor and attorney Oscar Goldman, who comes on and shares his stories of being a mob lawyer in Las Vegas. Oscar was the representative for Tony Spilatro and Frank Rosenthal way back in the day. The podcast also covers a lot of the goings-on in Las Vegas, specifically for downtown Las Vegas, including hotel changes, sales, who's in, who's out, shows that are coming to town, stuff like that. This is a podcast for the real Vegas nerd who loves the insider stuff. By the way, Jonathan Jossel, very, very active on social media, loves interacting with people. Plus, he's often spotted on the floor, in the restaurants, at the plaza, and loves saying hi to guests. All of the shows mentioned here in this episode are available wherever you get your podcasts, including Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And of course, I've got links to all of them in the show notes at jeffdoesvegas.com. And And that wraps up another episode of Jeff Does Vegas. If you've got feedback on this episode of the show, or any other episode for that matter, or you've got suggestions and ideas for topics you'd like me to cover on the podcast, please feel free to reach out to me via Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram at Jeff Does Vegas. Or drop me an email directly at jeff@jeffdoesvegas.com. In the meantime, thank you so much for checking out the show. Be sure to follow us wherever you get your podcasts so you'll know the moment new episodes are available. And don't forget to visit jeffdoesvegas.com for past episodes and show notes. My name is Jeff, and this has been Jeff Does Vegas, a Walker New Media production.